Welcome to Military History Inside Out, located at warscholar.org, the place for military history interviews. Today's interview covers a book about the United States Seminole Wars. Thank you for watching. Good afternoon. I'm speaking with Jamie Holmes, author of The Free and the Dead, The Untold Story of the Black Seminole Chief, the Indigenous Rebel, and America's Forgotten War, published by One Signal Publishers, coming out. What's the date that it's coming out?
On Tuesday, February 3rd.
Okay, good, 2026. All right. Give the listeners a bit of a background on uh, the date, time, area we're talking about. What's this book about?
Sure. First of all, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. It's my pleasure. Um, the book is about the Second Seminole War, which takes place between 1835 and 1842 in pre-statehood Florida. Florida becomes a U.S. territory in 1821, and it's not a state until 1845, which is quite late
Mhm.
for a state that far east of the Mississippi. And it's in the wake of Andrew Jackson signing in 1830 the Indian Removal Act, which is a nationalized systemization of a militarized policy of forcing indigenous families to the west of the Mississippi. In this case, they're forcing families into the Indian Territory or modern day Oklahoma.
Mhm.
And so the story is about three figures in that encounter. Also two on the U.S. side, but three figures on the Seminole side. One, the Black Seminole chief Abraham. The second is the Creek warrior Osceola, and the third is the Mikazuki chief Sam Jones Abiaka. And the book follows their threads. Really, it's more concerned with the politics of the story, the characters in the story, and I do go over the major military encounters, but um, it's not a military history per se, and it doesn't really focus on the federal policy story. It's really about the people, and of course the battles come into that story, the fights come into that story. But it's about the resistance of the Seminoles and their allies to the policy of removal, and and it's about the resistance of Black Seminole Chief Abraham to attempts by private individuals with the sanction of individuals in the government at high levels to try to enslave his people during this process.
Tell me, how did you get involved in this subject? What kind of studies were you doing, and what prompted you to actually write a book on this?
Yeah, my last book is called 12 Seconds of Silence. It's about World War II and the physicists that invented the proximity fuse, which was a device to better shoot down airplanes.
Mhm.
But it's very much in this style of book, which is historical narrative nonfiction. So it's it's everything is factual, and there's extensive original archive work both in that book and in this book. But it's written like a story. It's written like a novel, except everything is true. So I don't remember what I was Googling. I came upon a letter to the editor in the New York Times. I want to say it was dated 1991. And it said something to the effect of there was a rainbow coalition in Florida of African American and Native American warriors who were able to hold off the government for 40 years. And if we didn't have such a Eurocentric view of history, we should know this story. Something to that effect. I
Right.
read a second article after that, which was criticizing the emphasis in histories of indigenous peoples, that the emphasis on suffering,
Mhm.
uh, the lens of suffering, as if somehow emphasizing the suffering was like a respectful form of tribute. And the article said, of course, there was great suffering,
Mhm.
but the article's point was that this was overemphasized, overdone, and that there was stories, and being hidden implies intent, but stories underneath this, stories that were not questions of, were not best seen through that lens. And so this was a story where there wasn't, in fact, Sam Jones does win really, and Abraham wins in his own way. So there were elements of real victories that that had not, so those two things together, that is, this story doesn't fit this lens of suffering as tribute, which seems something to be wrong with that. And and there's this alliance between Native and African Americans that was interesting to me.
Yeah, I've definitely seen arguments that emphasizing suffering takes sometimes may take away the agency of the people who had done the suffering, and that those stories get
It's
hit.
passive. Yeah, it's passive. And it's strange to say the way that I'm showing my respect for you is like a picture of you suffering. Now,
Mhm.
if that's what happens factually, that's one thing. But the argument of this, and certainly what I found in this story, is that's really overemphasized and that there's a much more interesting story beneath it. Last time I checked on Wikipedia, it said there was 3,000 who died on the American side and 3,000 who died on the native side. Not even close to true. It's probably 3,000 on the US side and maybe three or 400 on the native side or 500. It's way less. It's not even close.
Mhm.
So there's something strange with which I haven't been able to quite understand with that lens. Anyway, those were the two things that drew me to the story, and then I began to see what had been written about it, and then I began to dive deeply into the archive work, and that was its whole adventure on its own.
So yeah, can you tell me about how you did the research for the book? Where did you get your information from?
Uh-huh. Yeah, so archives. It's the last book on World War II, all those records are federal. So all that stuff was in Washington, D.C. And some of the stuff for this story was in Washington. So I did go for almost 2 months to DC and uh, day in and day out at the National Archives in downtown and the Library of Congress as well, which has a lot of like it had General Jessup's files are there. Zachary Taylor, who's in this story, has files at the Library of Congress. Andrew Jackson, of course, although a lot of his stuff is digitized.
Hmm.
So there's DC. And then the other thing for this story, so part of the adventure is where are the archives, where are the best sources? Um, in this case, the best, really everyone who is writing stuff down is on the US side and their soldiers. So where did the soldiers go after the war? Where are their private letters and their private journals in which they're the most candid about what happened? Those are dispersed because they go home to wherever they're from, and the families give them to state historical societies or to local universities. So it was really a matter of trying to cover as much ground as I could. Oh, let's look at the Maine Historical Society. Oh, there's a journal that's never been cited before. So that was fun. So I went to West Point and wrote as many state archives as I could, searched as many state archives and local universities as I could, and just picked up as much as I could. And then it's a process of organizing all of that material, which takes quite a long time. Um, I had to create a 650-page Word document, which essentially had the digital name of everything I had taken photographs of with keywords. So I could, here are the 10 sources that mention Dade's battle in December of 1835. So I can say, okay, when I'm ready to write about that, I can just do a keyword search, pull up the primary sources. And then there was a process of figuring out who I could trust
Yeah.
because there's so much bias and error in the primary sources. And in fact, there's so much contradiction. Even for the same event, there's like three accounts and the accounts don't match.
Yep.
So you can write your way around that to a certain extent and say, one person says this, one person says this and that and so forth. The other thing to do is to figure out who is most trustworthy. So who is closest to the event and who, for example, there's a British-born Indian agent named John Casey, and there's three references to him being highly trusted by the Seminoles and their allies. It says he's the one who knows the Black Seminoles the best. It says he's the one who knows the Seminoles, and they trust him because he's always honest. And he has a line where he's clearly being respectful of Chief Abraham. Okay, let's look more closely at John Casey. Well, what do you know? In his 1837 diary at West Point, there's a whole bunch of information which has never been cited by scholars and doesn't appear in this literature. Indigenous accounts of what really happened at the siege of Fort Izards, accounts that he's writing down, he's transcribing from interviews of what happened at the coup in 1837 when Chief Abiaka takes control from Micanopy. And that story had been written up. We're not sure if it was a coup or if it was willing. It was a coup. And I found that as source and several other sources that confirmed that it was by force. Abraham's full family is in there. Abraham's will is in there. The names of Abraham's field commanders, the Black Seminole field commanders, the soldiers that fought under Abraham. So there was a wealth of information in that, but I basically followed that pattern of who can I trust? And a lot of the best sources turned out to be surgeons. They were the doctors.
Mm.
They were the most educated people there. They had, and there's an abolitionist named Phelps. He was quite good. So anyway, there's people from all over, and they're the most educated ones I found to be the most trustworthy sources.
So, of these many sources that you went over, what would you say is the most noteworthy among the documents, or you maybe came across artifacts,
Yeah.
and perhaps something that you totally didn't expect to find, and that was some great discovery?
Yeah. It depends on this story spans a number of literatures, right? You have like colonial history, there's African American history, there's indigenous history, there's the history of Florida, and there's military history. So the answer as to what is more surprising would sort of depend on which bucket you're writing in.
Mm.
For the military history, it's probably so in the military histories, one of the most famous moments of the war is when General Thomas Jessup seizes the warrior Osceola under a white flag.
Mm.
So this is taken as one of the great scandalous acts of the war. Jessup had given them a white flag. They were negotiating and fighting at the same time. He had given them white cloth. He said, come in and we'll talk. You won't be arrested. And there's two details that are, to my knowledge, additional to the story. One is a series of letters written by Andrew Jackson after he's out of office. So this is January, but he's out of his second term. He's back home at his plantation in Tennessee. And he writes Poinsett a series of 6 letters. And in several of them, he suggests that Jessup should have just seized Osceola. Just take him, just arrest him. One of these letters in fragment appears in Jessup's files in the Library of Congress. Now, it's dated 20 days before Jessup seizes Osceola. I don't know when Jessup or if Jessup received that letter before he arrested Osceola, but it's dated 20 days before he arrests Osceola. Okay. So was Jessup aware that Jackson was urging him to just take him? That's one thing. And I hadn't seen reference to this series of letters where Jackson is advising Poinsett, even though he's out of office. The second thing is that Jessup always blamed Osceola as justification for having arrested him under a white flag. He blamed him for his participation in the coup that I mentioned in 37. I want to say it's June 2nd, 1837. He said Osceola was part of this coup. They had Seminoles near Tampa Bay who were waiting to immigrate, who had agreed to immigrate. And there's a group of people who marched there. And as I mentioned, some people thought they went willingly. Some people thought they were forced off. And I show that they were forced off. And Jessup says Osceola was part of that action. But he says it months later. He says it when there's a risk of him being investigated by Congress for having arrested him. And so basically he is retroactively planting a gun in Osceola's hand and the other people who he arrested. And I have all of Jessup's letters. They're in bound notebooks at the National Archives, and they're all in sequence. So you can see exactly who he blamed right after that event. And he doesn't blame Osceola until months later, until he's in danger of being investigated. And I have a indigenous account which says that Osceola doesn't mention Osceola as being involved at all. And there's a newspaper account in which Jessup, in justifying seizing Osceola that day, it reprints the orders in the newspaper that he gave to the general that arrested him. And it said, it's because there was a murder nearby. It doesn't say anything about Osceola's participation in this action. It says there was somebody who was killed nearby. So I think probably for military history, those are relatively significant. There's also a source that discusses what happened at Izard, at the siege of Fort Izard in late February, early March, 1836. And there's a scholar named Cris Monaco. He almost got to this. He said, I think there's some break between the Seminoles and Mikazukis that seems to have happened around this time. And I found a report of this break. That is, they had a meeting. Because they had a siege at Fort Izard, and there was 1,100 troops that were in danger of starvation, and backup was on the way. And the native troops held a council, and they said, should we kill them? The other troops are coming. Or should we negotiate? And the Seminoles, led by Chief Jumper, said, too many have died. were not going to kill them, and the Mikazukis, including Osceola, almost certainly wanted to kill them, and the younger warriors wanted to kill them. And that did not happen. Now, after that point, the Seminoles and Mikazukis more or less split off, minus King Philip and his son Wildcat, who did fight with Sam Jones and the Mikazukis. And there's some smaller Seminole bands which stayed with Sam Jones, including Holatomiko or Holatomiko Che at that point, later Holatomiko, who Americans know as Billy Bowlegs. And Alligator may have been involved or may not have been. But I think that's another part of the story that's been underemphasized is the real split between the Seminoles and the divide between the Seminoles and the Mikazukis. In U.S. newspapers, they're always just called the Seminoles. But the generals, anyone involved intimately in the war knew that blanket term was covering up a lot of differences, that there was Seminoles and Mikazukis and Tallahassees and Uchis and Creeks down there. And they weren't entirely on the same page. This was a loose confederation. And so they sort of missed this. They missed the depth of the internal political dynamics and this split. So probably on the military side, that was the biggest surprise. There's a lot of new information about who the Black Seminoles were, that if you follow the history of scholars of African-American history who write about this, there's a lot of new information there, some of which I had mentioned. I would say overall, what surprised me is the degree to which General Jessup succeeded simply by seizing people. He writes a letter to Andrew Jackson after he takes Osceola, and he says something like, this is not going to be verbatim, and the stats are rough, but something like, I've killed 30 warriors up to this point, but I now have 550 prisoners. He did that for the most part simply by seizing them under false pretenses. So that's another story that's kind of like, I don't want to say hiding, that implies intent, but if you focus on the military battles, you miss the degree to which it was just seizing, and they took the women and children and they used them as leverage and kind of extorted the warriors to come in. That surprised me.
So, and this is a question, not a criticism. So the way you pronounce Mikazuki, I'm used to Mikasuki. I've heard Mikasuki a lot. You're emphasizing sort of a Z sound?
Sounds the same to me. But
okay.
But if you go to the Ahatiki Museum, and this is the Seminole Museum in Florida, they'll say, even among us, we're pronouncing these words differently. There are 300, according to Jack Martin, who's a scholar and specialist in Muskogee. There are 300 living speakers. So I've heard even the name of the museum, Ahatiki, pronounced 3 or 4 different ways. So it's I've heard it pronounced the way I actually didn't hear much of a difference in the way you said it, but you could be right.
Interesting. Were you able? So some of the spots that are talked about in the book, these historical areas, were you able to walk around any of them? Did you visit them?
Yeah, I did. I went to the Dade battlefield. You can't go to the area where the soldiers fell because it's cordoned off, but I went to that park. That was interesting. A little museum there. I went down to the Everglades to see what it was like. I went to the museum. I went to the Kruger and DePeyster plantation, the ruins of the forced labor camp, that sugar plantation by New Smyrna.
Okay.
I went to the ruins of Hernandez's plantation, also on the coast, called Malacompra. Bad purchase. And I went to the Castello de San Marcos in St. Augustine, where there was this dramatic prison escape in November of 1837. And I also dipped by to see what like the Cove of the Withlacoochee looks like. And I wanted to see kind of what these swampy areas where some of the fighting took place looked like. And I went to, that's past Abrahamstown. That's right near where, I'll probably mispronounce this too, Blicklikaha or Abrahamstown, where there's just a sign in the road. Apparently the real site is on private property about a mile off from that post.
So did actually seeing any of these places in person, did they give you any insights that you weren't thinking of before?
Yeah. The the part of the Cova with the Coochie that I went into for a little bit, there and there are descriptions of soldiers who are like fighting in these swamps where it make perfect retreats. Like, oh, you don't want to go in there. This is like a scary place to be.
Huh.
It reminded me a little bit of like the scene in Star Wars where Luke Skywalker is training with Yoda or something. It's like very foreboding.
Huh.
Um, and there are primary source accounts in which the soldiers describe, it seems designed to lower the morale of any soldier who goes in there, like sink pits and vines, or the Princess Bride, like the fire swamp, it's like you don't want to go in there. So that surprised me. I didn't expect. I mean, I had read that parts of Florida were subtropical, and I guess if you go far enough south, tropical.
Mhm.
And I knew that it was very flat and it was completely unique, but I wasn't prepared to see places that felt to me like I might be in Panama.
So during your research, what did you find that was particularly difficult to get an answer for, or maybe you still don't have it? And I know there's a lot that's
Yeah.
still unexplained, but something you really wanted to get at, but you couldn't.
I wish I knew more. I wish I was able to figure out who Chief Abraham's parents were.
Hmm.
And, there's a lot of hints. There's a literature that says um, that describes the Black Seminoles as Maroons, which would be descendants of formerly enslaved people who freed themselves.
Mhm.
That is part of their population, but there's another story there which I hadn't seen emphasized to the degree which seems proper, which seems relevant, which seems accurate, which is that there's a story in the Creek Nation. So, the Seminoles break off from the Creeks. They both
Mhm.
are Muskogee people in what is Alabama and Georgia and North Florida today.
Mhm.
But essentially, what happens is the Creeks side with the British in the Revolutionary War, and they take prisoners of wars. This includes Africans on the plantations.
Mhm.
By the old rules of Muskogee prisoners, you could basically kill someone or adopt them or make them your servant. It doesn't mean that they're doing hard labor on agricultural farms, but they are indebted to you and they are your servant in some way. But by the old rules, that's not based on skin color and that does not apply to your children. So what happens is the Creeks start to acculturate, and there's groups of them, and there's some intermixing with settlers, and you have half-breed Creeks, quote unquote, where they are starting to run plantations. They are starting to adopt the rules of chattel slavery and start to change their slave code in essence so that it's African and it's transgenerational.
Mhm.
The Seminoles, as late as 1774, were practicing the old Muskogee way, and there's a description of the children of POWs who were full members of the tribe. So part of the Black Seminole story is, and Thomas Jessup says this in his Library of Congress files, part of this group are descendants of enslaved people taken by the Creeks in former wars. So there's a place where children of POWs could have greater freedom among the Seminoles than they would have if they stayed among the Creeks. And if I had to guess, I would say, and I don't know, this is one of the things I would like to know. If I had to guess, I would not be surprised if Abraham's parents were prisoners of wars taken by Creeks in the Revolutionary War. Because there's the big split in the Creek Nation around 1790 in which this schism is happening and they're deciding, are we going to go into this new idea? And there's a huge population of African Americans among the Creeks that's driving this break. And that's when you start to see really the first sure recordings of the Black Seminoles in Florida. At the same time, you have this break among the Creeks. I wish I knew more about that. Yeah.
Yeah. Let me step back to the way you did your research quickly. Were you able to use any new technologies or current methods? I don't want to say AI, but that's one subset I'm thinking of. Like,
Yeah.
was any of that able to help you, in sorting through all the data and information and all of that?
Yeah. Yeah, right. So you can imagine like what researching this story would have been 70 years ago, let alone 20.
Hmm.
I mean, so there's the simple things which are just like Google Books, and you can keyword search within a book. or the
Hmm.
archive.org. But there was one technology that I was able to use that was quite helpful, which is, I'm gonna not know exactly how they refer to it, but if you go onto the National Archives website where they have digitized files, they have a lot of files from the Bureau of Indian Affairs that are digitized. And if you search NARA, let's say I want to search Seminoles, comma, Abraham,
Hmm.
I may get a result that says, okay, that Abraham and Seminole appears in, or Abraham interpreter, because he was also an interpreter as well as an advisor to Chief Micanopy. Then I'll see, okay, here are the 100 results in which Abraham and Seminole appeared. And 10 of them are going to be these huge bundles of cursive documents, which are 1,100 pages each, right? And it's basically telling me that it appears in there, but it doesn't tell me what page it is. So I wrote them and I said, you obviously have OCR capacity because you must, this is cursive. So somehow you've digitized the cursive and you're allowing me to do a keyword search, but you're not telling me the page it's on. You must have that information. And they kind of like, oh, I don't know. And I said, what do you mean? You obviously have it. They said, okay, well, there's a workaround in which we can give you like a special key that we give to developers, but we have to ask our partners because I think the people paying for this are genealogy sites. And I think that what they're doing is they have contracts with NARA and some exchange where like they are digitizing. Anyway, I think the OCR capacity is from the genealogy sites. And maybe it's not contractually clear, although I think it should
Yeah.
be, because
Hmm.
this is public information, that
Right.
that capacity to do the OCR should be free for anyway. So NARA
Hmm.
says, okay, we're going to give you this code and you can go and do this special hack, which you have to have some technical knowledge to do, and you'll be able to see what page it's on. I say, great, can you walk me through one example? So, and then I'll figure it out because you have to use terminal and I'm not a programmer. And they basically said, no, and they gave me instructions that had an error in the code that they gave me. Anyway, so I asked ChatGPT, please teach me how to do this. And it taught me how to do it in 20 minutes.
Nice.
So
Nice.
I was able to figure out how to basically the output that you get is like a 500 a 500 page Word document where
Hmm.
it has the OCR, the letters of the cursive at best, and there's errors and error, maybe 20% of that is error, but I could still search Abra and it will find, okay, here's where the 5 things, and then it gives you the link of the page number in that document. So I found a lot of information that I would not have found otherwise, because I don't have time to read 10,000 pages of cursive to find the 5 mentions of Abraham. So that's a capacity that's exciting going forward, and that should be publicly available to
Hmm.
American citizens
Yeah.
that
Great.
don't have to pay anything, shouldn't have to pay anything to have that, to access that.
So was there anything you couldn't include in your book for any reason, page count or some other reason?
Um, hmm, is there anything I couldn't include?
You
I
got
wish.
cut for, yeah, for length or whatever.
No, no. There was nobody told me at any point, don't put that in. Um, no. Uh I was trying to focus on one of the things that there's really two literatures that deal with this story. There's kind of a few Southern historians who don't really focus on the Black Seminole side of the story. And there's some historians in Florida who are great on this topic. And then there's kind of a literature on the left, which focuses more on the Black Seminoles. And that literature tends to suggest um, that the raids on the plantations were liberations. And it's not clear to me how true that's the case.
Hmm.
So in my proposal, I had much more of that emphasized. There are a few instances in which they are freeing people.
Hmm.
Some of those people were returned. So that's maybe another surprise where I thought this was, there's a literature which frames it more as a general war against enslavement, and I didn't find that. They fought for their own freedom, and they freed people that they knew, and in cases that helped people, and some people were able to leave Florida. But I think what's being confused there is like, Seminoles and the Creeks and others would raid these plantations during wartime, and they took POWs. So that's not necessarily a liberation. That could be. Anyway, that was one surprising thing, and I thought that was going to be in the book, and it ended up really not being much a part of it, except for a few instances which I highlighted. Other than that, no, I just tried to tell the stories of the people, and I wanted to really get these. I didn't expect to have Sam Jones or Abiaka be such a central part, but really he's the power behind Osceola. And I just wanted to focus on Abraham, Osceola, and Abiaka. And then, on the American side, there's Jackson, there's Jessup. Zachary, the future president, Zachary Taylor, is in there for a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But I wanted it to be about the people and yeah, and to focus on Abraham trying to save his people from being enslaved. Osceola is really after revenge, and he does get it, but he pays the price.
Mm-hmm.
And Sam Jones refusing to leave, and he succeeds at that. That's all I wanted to do, really, and then paint a picture of what Florida felt like and what the South was like at this time. And then the final chapter, there's an 1852 visit to New York, where sort of what does New York look like to the Seminoles and to Abraham, who's on that visit? Well, how do we look to them? Yeah. So no, there wasn't anything that I didn't want. I was in control.
So what in your research and writing had the most emotional impact on you, either positively or negatively?
I would say that what stands out to me is Abraham's character, the way he carried himself, the poise with which he carried himself, the way he was able to negotiate for his people's freedom in the context that he did it in the 1830s in the Deep South, surrounded by an army who knew that he participated in Dade's defeat, where 105 army men died as a man of color. And he was just very self-possessed. There's a tradition in the Black Seminoles of being diplomats, of helping, and advisors and diplomats. And I was just there's a scene in which he enters a camp of 1,300 men, and they've had about 50 women and children, almost entirely women and children, who have been seized by the army. And he goes in to negotiate on their behalf. And he says, I thought they might hang me, but I had resolved to die like a man if I had to make one last effort to save my people. His character sticks with me. The kind of propaganda around Osceola, the mythology around Osceola, sticks with me. I was thinking of that movie Unforgiven, where you have the writer character. He's kind of a wormy writer character, and he's, hey, the old West, and the guy, and who'd you kill first? And Clint Eastwood is trying to tell him, like, killing people is not awesome. This is not a cool thing. The people who are writing Osceola tend to write in that romantic vein, and so I write about Osceola. He's almost inseparable from the mythology. And then Sam Jones has been incredible. His character stuck out to me as well. He hid his power very tactical and very intelligently. So in the way that Osceola is very present and very vocal, and he's speaking out in these meetings and the negotiations, Abiaka is hiding his power. He's like pretending to be really old. He's like the old man, he's the old fisherman. He's already no longer the chief, and he's about to die, and he's incredibly sick, and he can't come. He's really afraid of the army. So it's great. And because of this tactic, the army doesn't know who he is, doesn't understand how powerful he is until 2 years after the war starts, and he's the chief of the nation. There are 3 books that come out, 4 if you count 1837, in the year right after the war begins, and they're kind of quick books, and we need to, they're not all entirely accurate. And Abiaka is not in them. He's one list on a list of 15 people, and he's, at the start of the war, definitely in the top 5, if not the top 2, and he becomes the most important figure of the war, really. And so the way in which he hid his power, and I personally think that Osceola was his, Osceola fought in his place in December 31st at the Battle of Okeechobee. It's another source I found, not seen that reference. And Osceola was his representative at the siege of Fort Izard. So in my opinion, it's not a coincidence that someone who was so talented at hiding his power and so deliberate put as his envoy the loudest, kind of most obvious warrior. And what the result of that, whatever his intention was in doing that, was to put all of the army's attention on Osceola. And there's even in the Third Seminole War, there's a history by Missile and Missile, this couple, and they say that the same thing sort of happened to Bowlegs, where William Bowlegs, where he becomes sort of a sacrificial lamb because Abiaka is hiding his power and staying back, and he's not visible in the meetings, and he's not going to meetings. So that story is incredible in its own right. And you have Abraham who saved his people. You have Abiaka who won the land. And what's the story that is in American textbooks? It's this warrior who wasn't a chief, at least at the beginning of the war, who was not a Seminole. He's a Creek allied with the Mikazukis, and it still appears in history books today. The leader of the Seminoles, the spirit of the war, which he was certainly not. So that's interesting. Which one gets picked, emphasized, and the two really more interesting stories that are kind of pushed below that.
Interesting. Apart from filling the historical gap and having readers enjoy a good read, what else would you like the book to do for readers?
For me, I wrote it because I get to have an adventure. I had done the World War II story. That's a certain context. And I was excited about jumping back to another period of time. This famous saying, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. So I wanted to travel to 1830s Florida. I wanted to feel what it was like, and I wanted to dive into these archives of a different era. And I really enjoyed that puzzle, enjoyed that experience. So my hope is that I was able to convey some of the adventure that I enjoyed. It's not the easiest story, but it's our story. It belongs to all of us. And in a lot of ways, it is heartening, and it doesn't, there's some happy endings in there. It's not all loss. And it's a picture of our country. It's where we, that's part of what produced now.
Yeah. So what's your next project, writing or otherwise?
I may stay in this genre. I have some ideas. I'm in discussions with my agent. There's a book by Bill Bryson called A Short History of Nearly Everything. There's something tempting me about kind of a big picture narrative story of Homo sapiens. To kind of jump through and get a kind of a big picture. There's some books like that. Sapiens is one. There are books in that kind of genre where you get a big snapshot of human history. And maybe I couldn't repeat what people have done, but maybe there's a twist on it I could find. Or there's several stories. There's several historical stories that I'm looking into that are just good stories and would be another journey to another place. Some other archival time and moment in American history.
Cool. Do you have a social media or website where people can follow your thoughts or work?
I'm not on social media, but I do have a website. It's Jamie. My last name is Holmes, Holmes. So it's JamieHolmesBooks.com.
Okay, good. Anything to add before we wrap up?
Thank you, Cris. That was a real pleasure. Fun chatting. The Free and the Dead, out February 3rd. It's a great story. I hope you enjoy it if you get it, and if you don't get it, maybe someone will tell you to get it, and I hope you enjoy it.
All right. Well, thank you for speaking with me. It has been a pleasure.
Thank you, Cris.
Thank you. Thank you for watching this video version of Military History Inside Out. For more historian interviews, please find Military History Inside Out at your favorite podcast provider or visit warscholar.org. We are also on Instagram at Cris Alvarez War Scholar, on X at War Scholar, and on Facebook at warscholar.org. Visit warscholar.org for more social media links and for military history related books and items for sale. Please check back regularly for more episodes and provide likes and subscribe where you can to support continued production of these episodes. Thank you for listening.